Welcome back to Clarkenomics. This video is a precursor to the videos about shifting supply and demand curves. Before we get into all that craziness, I thought it would be good to just go over what shifts supply and demand and what does not shift supply and demand. So this video is called Shifters Review. So first things first, demand shifters. There are 6 of them that we studied. And I put together this handy table. You could copy this into your notes if you wanted to, but you don't have to, where we look at the effects of taste, number of buyers, future expectations, income regarding normal goods, not inferior goods, prices of substitutes in consumption, and prices of complements in consumption. So I'm not going to go through this whole table, but if you'd like to pause the video and maybe write down any parts of this that you think you need, or you want to check this against notes that you already have, that might be a good idea. So these are demand shifters. Take a second if you need it. And if you don't need it, or you already took some notes or checked your notes, we can move on and take a little look here at supply shifters. Also 6 supply shifters, right? Changes in the prices of inputs, changes in technology, how we use those inputs, expectations of the future. Don't get confused. Remember that sellers like high prices, not low prices. Number of producers, prices of substitutes in production, and prices of complements in production. So these are all the things that we had talked about previously that will shift a supply curve. So again, if you need to add these to your notes or check your notes against these, take a second to do that now. Okay, so if that was enough time for you, great. If not, feel free to go back. But before we get into shifting some curves around, I'm going to give you guys 3 big reminders because students get confused about this kind of thing all the time. So, big reminder number 1. Only the shifters cause supply and demand curves to shift. What shifters? These shifters, right? If it's demand, these are the only things that will shift a demand curve. If it's supply, these are the only things that will shift a supply curve. What you see in the table is what you get. So, changes in prices, right? We've talked about this a couple of times. Changes in prices only cause movements along the curve, right? So if the price of flip-flops goes up, the demand curve for flip-flops doesn't shift. The supply curve for flip-flops doesn't shift. You would just see a movement along those curves. So remember, changes in the prices of a product do not shift the curves for that product. Now with that said, of course, reminder, if we're talking about prices of substitutes or prices of complements, either in production or consumption, that's a different thing, right? That is a shifter. Or if we're talking about future expectations of price, that's not a price change, that's just what people think is going to happen. So just because you see the word price, don't get confused all of a sudden and think, oh, that can't be a shift. You just have to pay attention to what we're talking about the price change of. So that's big reminder number 1. Only the shifters on those lists cause shifts. On a related note, this is probably the biggest thing that first-time economics students get messed up. Only the supply shifters cause the curves to shift. The curves don't shift each other. So you remember, looking back at those tables, one of the demand shifters was not a shift in supply, and one of the supply shifters was not a shift in demand. In other words, when one of those curves moves, that does not, in the short run, cause a shift in the other curve. So just because you shift the demand curve, don't assume that the supply curve is going to do something too. And if the supply curve shifts, don't assume the demand curve is going to shift. So we're going to hold one constant, right? Only shift one curve unless you're getting 2 different shifters for 2 different curves. And you'll see some examples of this later on. But again, students mess this up all the time when they're studying econ for the first time. They say, oh, well, if the supply shifts, the demand must shift. Not in the short run. If you ever take a more advanced economics course and you talk about long-run outcomes in perfectly competitive markets, then you can talk about effects on that. But at this level of economics, just remember, one curve shifting does not shift the other curve. I'm sorry if I sound redundant, but I cannot stress this enough. Don't make this silly mistake. Big reminder number 3. Ertl. There's Ertl. Hey, Ertl the turtle. So increase right, decrease left. With the demand curve, this is pretty easy because it visually looks like it's supposed to. But with supply curves, don't forget, you have to be very, very careful because sometimes a decrease in supply makes it look like the supply curve is shifting upwards when in fact it's only just moving to the left. So remember, increase right, decrease left, and you will not get confused when we start shifting multiple curves at the same time, because it can get crazy. Anyway, those are just some things we had to review to set ourselves up for the next topic. Thank you for watching.